Clara Whitfield pressed her mother's worn Bible against her chest and watched strangers carry every last piece of her life out the front door. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not give this town the satisfaction. But when Thomas Blackwood's man threw her mother's rocking chair into the dirt and laughed, something cracked open inside her. Something she had spent 27 years keeping sealed tight. She lifted her chin. She would not beg. Whatever came next, she would face it standing. Chapter 1. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment. Tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1878 came down hard on Red Hollow, Montana, the kind of heat that cracked leather and dried up creeks, and made men say things they would later regret. The town sat at the foot of the Bitterroot Range, squeezed between rock faces and cattle trails, and on a Tuesday morning in late July, every soul who could walk had gathered in front of the old grain exchange on Main Street. Thomas Blackwood had called a public auction. It wasn't the first time, and most folks in Red Hollow had stopped asking questions about how Blackwood came to acquire the properties he sold. You didn't ask questions in this town if you wanted to keep doing business in it. Clara Whitfield stood at the edge of the crowd with a carpetbag at her feet and her mother's Bible under her arm. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten since the evening before. And she had spent the last hour trying very hard not to think about the fact that the house being auctioned off this morning was the same house where her mother had died 6 weeks ago. She was 27 years old. She had no husband, no property, and exactly $3.40 to her name. What she did have was her spine, and she held on to that with both hands. Lot 14, called out a thin man in a too-tight suit reading from a clipboard. The Whitfield property on Birch Lane. 2 rooms working well, half an acre. Debt outstanding to Blackwood Savings and Loan in the amount of $112. Bidding starts at $50. Clara heard her own name spoken like it was a number, like her mother's house was just an entry in a ledger. A man in the crowd called out $60. Another voice followed quickly. $75. She had tried to pay the debt. She had gone to the bank 4 times. Twice the door had been closed in her face. The third time, a man behind a desk had told her that her mother's original loan paperwork had been lost, and the terms had been recalculated. The fourth time, Blackwood himself had walked out from his back office, looked her up and down, and said, "Miss Whitfield, you have nothing I want. This conversation is over." She hadn't slept well since. Now she stood in the heat and watched strangers bid on the only thing her mother had ever owned. The man in the too-tight suit kept calling numbers. The crowd shuffled and murmured. Clara watched a woman near the front lean toward her husband and whisper something, and then both of them looked at Clara, and the woman made a small pinched expression, the kind that meant she was pretending to feel sorry while actually feeling satisfied. Clara had seen that expression a lot since her mother passed. The bidding reached $105, then $110. Then a voice Clara didn't recognize called out, $120. And the crowd went quiet, because that voice had a kind of weight to it. Not loud, not aggressive. Just settled in a way that made people stop talking without quite knowing why. She turned along with half the crowd. Ethan Callahan stood at the back of the gathering with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his hat pulled low. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, narrow through the hips, with the kind of build that came from 20 years of real work and not one day of sitting behind a desk. His jaw was set. His eyes were unreadable. Clara didn't know him. She had heard the name, everyone in the county had heard the name, but she had never had cause to speak to the man who ran the Callahan Ranch up in the high country. He wasn't a Red Hollow regular. He came down to town maybe twice a season, did what he needed, and left without socializing. The auctioneer cleared his throat. $120 from Mr. Callahan. Do I hear $130? A long pause. Then the bid was closed. Clara exhaled. She didn't know what to feel. A stranger had just bought her mother's house. That was not an improvement on the situation. She picked up her carpet bag and turned to walk away before anyone could speak to her, because she had reached the absolute limit of what she could endure in public today. She had taken maybe 4 steps when she heard Blackwood's voice cut through the crowd behind her. "Where do you think you're going, girl?" She stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She gave herself 3 full seconds to decide whether she was going to keep walking or whether she was going to turn and face whatever this was. Her mother had always told her that those 3 seconds were everything. The seconds between what happened to you and what you chose to do about it. She turned. Thomas Blackwood was standing on the steps of the grain exchange, and he was not looking at her with satisfaction or contempt. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he wants to make an example of. He was 62 years old, well-dressed with silver hair and a gold watch chain, and the particular kind of confidence that came from never having been told no in a very long time. Behind him stood 2 of his men bigger than he was, arms crossed, expressionless. "I have something to say," Blackwood announced to the crowd rather than to Clara specifically. "And since we're all here together, I think this is as good a time as any to say it." The crowd, which had been starting to disperse, settled back in. Blackwood descended the steps slowly. He stopped about 10 feet from Clara. "This young woman has been telling stories around town," he said, "about my bank, about the loan her mother took, about certain paperwork." He paused. "I want to be clear with everyone standing here today, those stories are false. Eleanor Whitfield borrowed money she could not repay. The terms were straightforward. And her daughter has been making accusations she cannot support, which I suspect is a last attempt to cause trouble before she moves on." The crowd was quiet. A few heads nodded. Clara felt her face go very still. "I haven't told stories," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I said that the original loan document your bank gave my mother showed a different repayment schedule than the one you presented to me 6 weeks after she died. That is not a story. That is a fact." "Do you have that original document?" Blackwood asked, and there was a small, pleasant smile on his face. "You know I don't. Your office told me it was lost." "Lost." He spread his hands. "Unfortunate, but hardly my doing." He looked at the crowd again. "The fact is, women like this young alone with no standing in this community sometimes struggle with the realities of the world. I understand that. I even sympathize. But that sympathy has limits." He looked back at Clara. "You've been in this town your whole life and you have no property, no employment as of last month, and no family left. What you do have is the habit of blaming others for your circumstances. I'd recommend against carrying that habit wherever you go next, because Red Hollow isn't the only town that will grow tired of it." The silence that followed was the worst kind. The kind where everyone is listening and no one says anything because they've all privately already decided whose side they're on, and it isn't yours. Clara's jaw tightened. She could feel the heat behind her eyes, and she absolutely refused to let it become anything more than that. She opened her mouth. "She won't be going anywhere." The voice came from behind her. She turned. Ethan Callahan was walking forward through the crowd, which parted for him, without anyone quite deciding to do so. He stopped beside her, not in front of her, not shielding her but beside her, and he looked at Blackwood with the same flat, settled expression he'd had since she first noticed him. "I don't believe I was addressing you, Callahan," Blackwood said. "No," Ethan agreed. "You were addressing her, and I'm telling you she doesn't need to listen to any more of it." He paused. "The auction's done. You got your money. Whatever point you were making just now, it's made. Move on." Blackwood's pleasant smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes shifted. "This is a public gathering, Ethan. I can say what I like." "You can," Ethan said. "And I can say what I like too." He glanced briefly at Clara, just a glance quick and assessing, and then looked back at the crowd, not at Blackwood. "Miss Whitfield isn't leaving. She's staying in Red Hollow, and she won't be needing to worry about housing because she'll be staying at my ranch." The silence changed. It had a different texture now, sharper. Someone at the back of the crowd made a low sound. "Ethan," said Blackwood, his voice dropping in a way that was meant to sound like a warning among reasonable men. "Be careful." "She's my wife," Ethan said. Clara stopped breathing. The crowd erupted not loudly, but in that particular way of a small town, where everybody's talking to the person next to them at once, and the combined effect is a roar made of whispers. She turned to look at him. He was still watching the crowd. His expression hadn't changed. "Excuse me?" she said quietly enough that only he could hear it. He didn't look at her. "I understand you're confused," he murmured. "Confused," she repeated, and she was proud of how level her voice sounded. "That is one word for it." Blackwood had recovered himself. He was looking between them with an expression that was no longer pleasant, and not quite unpleasant either, calculating, she thought, like he was doing arithmetic. "You're married," he said to Ethan. "Since when?" "Since it's none of your business," Ethan said. He finally looked down at Clara, and there was something in his eyes, not warmth exactly, but a kind of deliberateness, like he was asking her something without asking. "We married quietly. Neither of us wanted a fuss." The crowd was buzzing. Clara was aware of dozens of eyes on her face. She was 27 years old. She had spent her whole life in this town, and she knew exactly how fast a story moved through Red Hollow and exactly what kind of damage a lie could do if it fell apart. She also knew what her options were. If she walked away from what Ethan Callahan had just done, she could leave town with $3.40 and her mother's Bible, or she could stay and fight Blackwood alone with no resources, no property, and no proof of anything. She thought of her mother. She thought of the rocking chair in the dirt. She looked up at Ethan Callahan and said clearly enough for the people nearest to hear, "He doesn't like a fuss, never has." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was something. Blackwood studied them both for a long moment. Then he straightened his jacket, reset that pleasant look on his face, and nodded once. "Well," he said. "Congratulations, I suppose." He turned and went back up the steps, and his two men followed him, and the door of the grain exchange closed. The crowd began to break apart. People moved away in twos and threes, talking in low voices. A few of them looked at Clara as they passed, some curious, some skeptical, one older woman with a kind expression that felt genuine, and caught Clara briefly off guard. When the last of the crowd had thinned enough that no one was listening, Clara turned to face Ethan Callahan directly. "All right," she said. "Tell me what that was." He looked at her steadily. "What it looked like? It looked like a man I have never met in my life told an entire town I was his wife." "That's about right." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet, thinking quiet. "Because you were outnumbered," he said finally. "And Blackwood was about to make sure you had nowhere to go and no credibility left when you did." "He was already well on his way to that before this morning," Clara said. "What does it gain you?" His eyes moved to hers and stayed there. "Who said it gains me anything?" She held his gaze. "A man like you doesn't ride down from the high country to buy a property at auction and claim a stranger as his wife without a reason. So, I'll ask again, what does it gain you?" He was quiet again. A longer pause this time. "There's a provision in my father's land deed," he said, and his voice changed very slightly, not softer, but less guarded, which was different. "I inherited the Callahan ranch outright, but there's a clause my father put in when he wrote the deed. If I'm unmarried when I turn 40, the northern quarter section reverts to the county for resettlement. My father thought—" He stopped. He had ideas about what a man's life should look like. The kind of ideas men of his generation had. "You're turning 40, Clara said. "In 4 months. And you need a wife. I need a legal marriage on the county record before October 15th. Clara stood with that for a moment. The sun was directly overhead now, and the heat pressed down from every direction, and somewhere down the street, a horse stamped and blew. "And so you picked me," she said. "A woman you've never spoken to. A woman Blackwood just publicly called a liar." "I picked a woman who clearly has no reason to stay in this town as she is," he said, "and who might find a better situation at a working ranch with a real house and a roof that doesn't leak, in exchange for being on a county record as my wife." "A legal arrangement," Clara said. "Nothing more, nothing less." She looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away, and he didn't add anything to make the offer sound better than it was, which she found against her better instincts to be a point in his favor. "Where's the ranch?" she asked. 12 miles north, up in the high country. The road's rough for the last 3 miles, but manageable by wagon. "You said my mother's Bible." He blinked, confused. "You didn't," she corrected herself. "I said it. Never mind." She picked up her carpet bag. "I have 2 conditions." He waited. "First, I work. I'm not a decoration, and I'm not charity. I'll earn my place." "Fair enough. Second, when I find proof of what Blackwood did to my mother's property, and I will find it, you don't stand in my way. You don't tell me to let it go. You don't tell me it's not my fight anymore because I'm a respectable rancher's wife now. You stay out of it." He studied her for a moment. "You think you can find proof. I think my mother didn't borrow money she couldn't repay. I think the terms of that loan were changed after she signed the original document. And I think Thomas Blackwood has done it to other people in this town, and none of them had the nerve to say so." "That's a long way from proof." "I know," she said. "I didn't ask for your opinion on my odds. I asked if you'd stay out of my way." Something moved behind his eyes. Not amusement, closer to assessment. Like she was a fence line he was trying to figure out the length of. "Agreed," he said. She nodded once. "Then we have an arrangement." He picked up her carpet bag before she could reach for it. She almost objected, and then didn't, because this was clearly not a man who made gestures unless he meant them, and arguing about the bag seemed like a waste of both their energies. They walked to his wagon without speaking. He had a good horse, a dark roan, well-muscled with a calm eye, hitched to a solid wagon. He set her bag in the back and waited while she climbed up to the seat. As he came around to his own side, she heard a voice behind them, a woman from the crowd, someone who hadn't quite dispersed far enough. "Married," the woman said to someone beside her in that particular tone that was just loud enough to be heard. "To a man like that, living up in the mountains. Poor thing doesn't even know what she's gotten herself into." Clara looked straight ahead. Ethan climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked the roan into motion. They rolled down Main Street past the grain exchange, and the bank with its gleaming windows and the row of storefronts, and Clara sat straight-backed and looked at everything without blinking. When they had cleared the edge of town and the road opened up ahead of them, Ethan said, without looking at her, "You don't have to pretend nothing bothers you." "I know I don't," she said. "I'm not pretending." He glanced at her sideways. "Things bother me plenty," she said. "I just deal with them after, not during." He looked back at the road. They drove in silence for a while. The road climbed gradually as the mountains came nearer and the air changed drier and a little cooler, scented with pine and sage. The heat was still present, but less oppressive. After nearly an hour, he said, "The ranch has 4 men working it year-round. They know me. They know what I expect. They're not going to make things difficult for you, but they're not going to know what to make of you either, at least not at first." "I can handle that. I expect so." A pause. "What did you do before, for work?" "Sewing mostly. I made alterations for people in town. I also helped Mrs. Reardon at her house. She's elderly, and her daughter moved to Portland. And I helped Doc Harmon with patients sometimes. Nothing medical, just sitting with people, keeping records." "You can read and write." "I can also do arithmetic," she said dryly. "And I know double-entry bookkeeping." He looked at her again. "My father taught me," she said. "Before he died. He thought it was practical. He was right." Ethan turned his eyes back to the road, but she had the distinct impression he had just revised something in his assessment of her, and she filed that away. "The ranch books are a mess," he said. "I noticed you didn't hire anyone to help with them. I don't like people going through my business." "And yet," she said. He almost said something and then didn't, and she let the silence sit there. The road bent north, following a creek bed, and ahead of them, the Bitterroot Peaks rose blue and enormous against the pale sky. The land up here was different from town. Bigger, quieter, less cluttered with human noise. Clara had never been this far north. She looked at the mountains. She thought about her mother, about the rocking chair in the dirt, about Thomas Blackwood's pleasant smile. She thought about the original loan document, the one she had read herself sitting at her mother's kitchen table 3 years ago when Clara Whitfield had first taken the loan. She had read every line of it. She remembered the terms clearly. The repayment schedule had been $14 a month for 8 years. Her mother had been making those payments faithfully. The document Blackwood's bank had shown Clara after her mother's death had a different schedule. $22 a month, retroactive from the beginning. It was fraud. She knew it in her bones. She just had no way to prove it without the original. But she knew something Blackwood probably didn't know. She knew her mother had been meticulous. Clara Whitfield had kept records of everything. Every payment she'd ever made. Every letter she'd ever sent or received. 40 years of careful documentation kept in a cedar chest in the spare room. That cedar chest had been in the house on Birch Lane when it was auctioned this morning. And the house on Birch Lane now belonged to Ethan Callahan. She glanced sideways at him. He was watching the road. "You bought my mother's house this morning," she said. "I did." "Why?" He took a moment. "It came up in the auction, and I had the money." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have right now." She studied his profile, the set jaw, the careful eyes, the way he held the reins, with exactly the right amount of tension, not too tight and not too loose. A man who knew how to handle things. "There's a cedar chest in the spare bedroom," she said. "Brown, brass hinges. It has my mother's name burned into the lid." "I won't move anything in the house until you've had a chance to go through it," he said without hesitation. She hadn't expected that. She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and the words came out a little rougher than she intended, which was what happened when you'd been holding something tight all day and something small and unexpected touched it. He nodded, once eyes on the road. They didn't speak again until the ranch came into view, a cluster of dark timber buildings against the hillside, a long barn, a corral with 6 or 8 horses moving in the late afternoon heat. It was substantial, more than she'd expected. The main house was 2 stories built solid with a covered porch running along the front. One of the ranch hands came out of the barn as they pulled into the yard, a wiry man of about 50, with a sun-creased face and sharp eyes. "Didn't expect you back this early," the man said, and then he saw Clara on the seat beside Ethan and stopped talking. "Holt," Ethan said, climbing down and tying the roan. "This is Clara. She'll be staying at the ranch." Holt looked at Clara with the uncomplicated directness of a man who had worked outdoors his whole life and didn't waste time on social performance. "Ma'am," he said. "This is my wife," Ethan said. "Starting today." Holt's face didn't change much. He looked at Clara for a moment, then back at Ethan, then back at Clara. "Huh," he said, which seemed to cover everything he thought about the situation. "I'll put her things in the east room," Ethan said. "East room's got a busted window latch," Holt said. "Then fix it." Holt looked at Clara again. "Welcome to the Callahan Ranch, ma'am." "Thank you, Mr. Holt," she said. "Just Holt, ma'am. Nobody calls me Mr. anything." "Holt, then." He nodded once the same economical nod she'd seen Ethan use, and went back into the barn. Ethan brought her carpet bag in from the wagon and showed her the east room, which was plain and clean and had a window that looked out over the corral and the mountains beyond. He showed her where the water pump was, the outhouse, the kitchen. He told her the cook, a man named Garrett, came in at 6 every morning, and supper was at 7 in the evening, no exceptions. He showed her around with the manner of a man who was used to explaining practical things and expected practical questions in return, and she asked practical questions, and it was oddly comfortable in the way that working alongside a competent person is always comfortable regardless of the circumstances. When the tour was done, they were standing in the kitchen, and the light had gone orange and long through the west-facing windows. "We should talk about what we tell people," Clara said. "I'll leave that to you," he said. "You seem to know this county's gossip patterns better than I do. We should have a story that holds up, how we met, how long we've known each other. Simple is better. Simple stories have fewer holes. He leaned against the kitchen doorframe and crossed his arms. All right, we met 2 years ago, when you came to town for supplies and my mother was selling preserves at the dry goods. You came back a few times. It wasn't something we talked about to anyone because you don't like talk, and I respected that. That's close enough to something that could be true, he said. It needs to be close enough to something that could be true. Because Blackwood is going to pull at every thread he can find, and if this comes apart, it doesn't just cost you the land clause. It gives him ammunition he'll use against both of us. You think he'll do that? I know he will, she said. He's not finished with me. This morning was about pride as much as the property. I said he altered documents. In public. In front of his customers. She met his eyes. He's going to come back at me. Ethan was quiet. I'm not telling you that to frighten you, she said. I'm telling you because you agreed to stay out of my fight. And I want to make sure you know what your own name is going to get attached to when that fight gets bigger. He studied her for a long moment. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and the grease on the cast iron hanging from the wall. Outside, she could hear one of the horses moving in the corral. I grew up in this county, he said finally. My father built this ranch with his hands. Thomas Blackwood tried to buy us out twice in the 12 years before my father died, and my father turned him down both times. The land clause was my father's attempt to make sure I couldn't sell even if I wanted to, because he knew. He stopped. He knew I had trouble holding on to things. It was the most he had said at once. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. Then we understand each other, she said. Well enough, he said. She turned to look out the kitchen window at the mountains, purple now in the fading light. The peaks looked like something permanent, something that had been there long before Thomas Blackwood and his bank, and would be there long after. I'm going to find that original document, she said. You think it's in the cedar chest? I think my mother made copies of everything. She was that kind of woman. You get your spine from her, Ethan said. Clara looked at him. He was still leaning in the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her with that assessing look she was starting to recognize. Yes, she said. I do. He nodded once. He pushed off the doorframe, and she heard his boots on the floor as he moved down the hallway, and then a door, and then quiet. Clara stood in the kitchen alone and breathed in the sage-scented evening air coming through the window crack. And she thought about her mother. And she thought about the rocking chair in the dirt. And she thought about the look on Blackwood's face when he said the terms were recalculated. And then she stopped thinking about all of it the way her mother had taught her, and she thought instead about what she needed to do next. The cedar chest. The loan payments her mother had documented. A county record that needed a marriage on it before October 15th. A mountain cowboy with 4 months and a land clause and a kitchen that smelled like wood smoke. She didn't know yet what any of this was going to become. But she was still standing, and as long as she was standing, she was not finished. Clara woke before the sun came up. She lay still for a moment, listening to the ranch settle around her, the creak of timber, the distant sound of horses shifting in the corral, the low, steady presence of mountains she couldn't see but could feel. Then she got up, dressed, and went to find the kitchen. Garrett the cook was already there. He was a broad man with flour on his shirt, and the expression of someone who had been awake since an unreasonable hour and was entirely at peace with that. He looked at Clara when she walked in and said, "Coffee's hot," without any additional comment on her presence, which she appreciated more than she could say. She poured a cup and stood at the counter and drank it. "You need something to do," Garrett said. It wasn't a question. "I always need something to do," she said. He jerked his chin toward a basket of potatoes near the back door. She found a knife and got to work. They didn't talk much, but by the time the sun was fully up, and Holt and the other hands had come in for breakfast, she had peeled and quartered enough potatoes for 8 people, scrubbed the cast iron that had been soaking since last night, and found where Garrett kept the inventory ledger for the kitchen supplies, a battered notebook that hadn't been updated since March. "Can I update this?" she asked him, holding up the notebook. He glanced at it. "Knock yourself out," he said. She sat down at the kitchen table with the ledger and a pencil and started going through the shelves. That was how Ethan found her when he came in at 7:30, sitting at his kitchen table with flour on her sleeve and a ledger open in front of her, writing in neat, precise columns. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't look up. "The sugar is nearly out, and you're paying too much for salt. The Mercantile in Millerton sells it cheaper than the Red Hollow store." A pause. "How do you know what I'm paying for salt?" "Garrett keeps receipts in the back of this notebook." She turned a page. "Also, you have 8 pounds of dried beans that have been in that cabinet since last November, and they're starting to turn. You should use them this week or throw them out." Another pause. "Good morning," Ethan said. She looked up. "Good morning." He got his coffee and sat down across from her. He looked at her for a moment with that same measuring expression he'd had the day before, and she could see him deciding something. "The house on Birch Lane," he said. "I can take you over there today if you want." She set the pencil down. "Yes, I want." They went after breakfast. The drive back into Red Hollow felt different in the morning light, quieter, the town not yet fully awake. Ethan pulled the wagon around to Birch Lane, and she climbed down before he'd fully stopped. The house looked smaller than she remembered. She'd grown up in this house, and it had always felt snug and sufficient, and now it looked diminished somehow, the way things look when someone you love is no longer inside them. She went up the front steps and through the door, still unlocked, because no one had gotten around to changing the situation yet, and went straight to the spare room. The cedar chest was there. She knelt in front of it and pressed both palms flat against the lid for a moment. Her mother's name was burned into the wood, Eleanor R. Whitfield. Her father had made this chest as a wedding present. Her mother had kept it at the foot of the bed for 30 years before she'd moved it to the spare room when her eyesight got bad and she stopped sewing. Clara lifted the lid. The smell came out first, cedar and lavender, and something underneath that was just her mother, the particular scent of the woman herself, and Clara breathed it in and held it, and then she reached in and started going through the contents. Ethan stood in the doorway. He didn't come in, and he didn't ask questions. He just stood there in case she needed something. She found the payments first. Her mother had documented every single one, $14 faithfully, every month for 3 years. Each receipt handwritten, dated, signed with the bank's stamp on every page. Then she found the original loan document. Her hands stopped moving. It was folded inside an envelope marked, "Bank Original Terms, Do Not Lose." Her mother had underlined that last part twice. Clara unfolded it. The repayment schedule read exactly as she'd remembered, $14 a month for 8 years. The signature at the bottom was Thomas Blackwood's. The date was March 1875. There was a notary stamp in the corner. She sat back on her heels. "I have it," she said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Is it what you thought?" "It's exactly what I thought." Her voice was very level. "He changed the terms after my mother signed. He changed them, and then he waited until she died to present the new document because he knew she couldn't contest it, and he thought I wouldn't have the original." She looked down at the paper in her hands. "He didn't know about the chest. What are you going to do with it?" "Do." She folded the document carefully and put it back in the envelope. "I need a lawyer," she said. "A real one, not someone Blackwood has in his pocket." "That rules out half the county," Ethan said dryly. "I know." She stood. "There's a man in Millerton. Name of Franklin Price. He worked federal land cases for 10 years before he moved out here. Mrs. Reardon told me about him once. She said he was the kind of man who didn't take money from people who were already owed it." She looked at Ethan. "Would you take me to Millerton? When do you want to go?" "Soon. This week if possible." She looked around the spare room, the slanted light, the empty walls where her mother's quilting had hung. "I want to take the chest. All of it. The receipts, the document, everything. Take what you need." She took everything. They rode back to the ranch with the cedar chest in the wagon bed, and Clara held the envelope in her lap the whole way, and she thought about her mother making those payments every month, $14. Never late, never missing for 3 years. while a man in a nice suit had already written a different story about her debt and was just waiting for the right moment to tell it. That evening, she asked Ethan about Franklin Price. They were in the front room after supper, she with the ranch's actual account books, which she'd asked if she could look at, and he'd said yes without discussion. And he was doing something with a piece of tack that needed repair sitting near the lamp. "You know of him?" she asked. "I've heard the name," Ethan said. "My father mentioned him once, said he was honest." "That's a short recommendation. My father didn't give long ones, but honest from him meant more than most people's speeches." She looked at him over the top of the account book. In the lamplight, he looked different, less formidable, the lines of his face, less guarded. He was focused on the leather in his hands, and his jaw was slightly relaxed. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." "The land clause. Your father put it in the deed. Did he tell you why?" Ethan's hands slowed on the tack. He didn't stop, but his rhythm changed. "I told you why. He had ideas about what a man's life should look like. That's what he told you. I'm asking what you think." A pause. "I think he was worried about me," he said finally. "After my mother died, He stopped. "I wasn't in good shape for a while. A few years. I did the work because the work was there, and animals need tending whether you're falling apart or not, but I didn't do much else. Didn't talk to people. Didn't come down to town. Holt kept this place running in those years more than I did." He set the piece of tack down. "My father was alive for 3 of those years. He watched it. He didn't say much because he wasn't a man who said much, but he knew. And I think the clause was his way of saying, he picked the tack back up. Keep living, or lose what you're working for." The room was quiet except for the lamp and the distant sound of horses. "How long ago did your mother die?" Clara asked. 14 years. She looked back at the account book. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago." "It doesn't always feel like a long time," she said. "Even when it is." He looked up at her, and for just a moment, something moved across his expression that wasn't guarded or measured. It was there, and then it was gone, packed back away behind that flat, careful exterior. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She didn't push further. She went back to the accounts, and he went back to the tack, and the lamp burned low between them, and it was, she thought, the most natural evening she'd had in a very long time, which was strange given the circumstances. She was still thinking about that when she went to bed. She was still thinking about it at breakfast the next morning, when Holt came in with a look on his face she hadn't seen from him before, quick, slightly tight around the eyes. "Ryder came up from town," he said. "Left a message at the bottom of the North Road. Didn't come up to the house." Ethan looked at him. "What message?" Holt looked at Clara, and then back at Ethan. "Said Mr. Blackwood wants a meeting, with both of you, at the bank, day after tomorrow at noon." The kitchen went quiet. Clara set her coffee cup down. "He moved fast," Ethan said. "He's testing us," Clara said. "He wants to see if we'll come. If we come, he thinks he can manage us. If we don't, he knows we're hiding something." "So we go," Ethan said. "We go," she agreed. "But we don't go unprepared." She spent the rest of that day going through every piece of paper in the cedar chest and organizing it into a clear sequence. Payments, dates. Correspondence, the original loan document. She wrote out a summary in her neatest hand, 2 pages covering every discrepancy between the original terms and the document Blackwood had presented after her mother's death. Ethan came and sat across from her at the kitchen table in the late afternoon and watched her work. "You've done this kind of thing before," he said. "I used to help Doc Harmon keep his patient records," she said, not looking up. "And I kept the books for my father's business when I was 15. He was a carpenter. He wasn't good with numbers." "You were keeping books at 15. "I was keeping books at 12. 15 is when I got good at it." She turned a page. "Numbers don't lie. That's why I like them. People change their stories. Numbers stay the same." Unless someone alters a loan document, Ethan said. She looked up. Exactly, and that's exactly what makes it provable. Because the original numbers and the altered numbers can't both be true. One of them is a lie, and the other one is the truth, and you can prove which is which if you have both documents. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. And you have both. I have both. He was quiet for a moment. When we go to that meeting, what do you expect Blackwood to do? He'll start with the social approach, she said. He'll be pleasant. He'll suggest that this has all been a misunderstanding. He'll offer something small, maybe some symbolic amount, and suggest that a settled woman who's just gotten married might prefer to put unpleasant things behind her and start fresh. And when that doesn't work, then he'll remind you quietly of all the ways a man in his position can make a ranch operation difficult: supply lines, credit, water rights if he can find an angle. She met Ethan's eyes. He's going to try to come between us. That's going to be his main strategy. He'll assume that since our arrangement is as it is, there are fault lines he can press on. Ethan held her gaze. Then we don't show him fault lines. Agreed. He sat back. Are you afraid of him? She thought about it honestly. Not of him personally, she said. I'm aware of what he can do, but fear and awareness aren't the same thing, and I try not to confuse them. Something crossed his face again, that same quality she'd glimpsed the night before, unguarded and brief. My father used to say something like that, he said. Your father sounds like he was a clear-headed man. He was the clearest-headed man I ever knew. A beat. He would have liked you. She looked at him. He seemed to realize what he'd said and looked down at the table, and there was the smallest tension in his jaw that wasn't quite embarrassment, but was in the neighborhood. That's a kind thing to say, she said, and let it rest there. The day before the meeting, Holt found her in the barn, where she'd been talking to one of the hands, a younger man named Will, who'd been trying to balance the feed ratios for the summer grazing, and said there was someone at the front of the ranch road. Woman, Holt said. On a gray mare. Says she knows you. Clara went to look. The woman on the gray mare was Margaret Cooley, 40 years old, stout with bright eyes and a permanent expression of having just heard something she found interesting. She ran the dry goods store with her husband, and she was, as far as Clara knew, the most reliably honest person in Red Hollow. Clara Whitfield, Margaret said. Or I suppose I should say Clara Callahan now. Margaret, Clara said. What brings you out here? Couldn't exactly leave a message with anyone in town, could I? Margaret climbed down from the mare and handed the reins to Clara without being asked, as though they'd been doing this for years. I heard something last night that I think you should know. Clara tied the mare. Tell me. Silas Vance was at the saloon. The man Blackwood has doing his legal work. Not a real lawyer, mind you. Just a man Blackwood trusts who can read a contract. He was talking. Margaret lowered her voice, even though there was no one within earshot. He said Blackwood is going to that meeting with a new document. Something he's having drawn up right now. A deed transfer showing that your mother voluntarily signed over the property to cover her debt. Not after she died. 2 years before. Clara felt something go very cold and very still inside her. She never signed anything like that, she said. I know she didn't, Margaret said. I know Eleanor Whitfield. She would have told me. A pause. But if Blackwood walks into that meeting with a document that says she did, and you don't have proof otherwise... I have proof otherwise, Clara said. Margaret blinked. You do. I have the original loan document, and 3 years of payment receipts, every single one stamped by the bank. She met Margaret's eyes. He didn't know about the chest. Margaret stared at her for a moment. Then she made a sound that was almost a laugh and pressed one hand over her mouth. Lord above, she said. Eleanor kept everything. She always did. Then you go to that meeting, Margaret said, and you take every piece of it with you. She took Clara's hand and squeezed it hard. There are people in this town who know Thomas Blackwood has been doing this for years. They've been too afraid to say so. But if you walk into that bank with Eleanor Whitfield's proof in your hands—" She released her hand and stepped back. "You won't be walking in alone." She rode back to town, and Clara stood in the road and watched the gray mare go, and the cold, still feeling was still inside her. But it had changed into something else, something harder and more specific. She went to find Ethan. He was in the corral working with a young horse that didn't want to be worked, with a situation that she had noticed he approached with remarkable patience and no wasted motion. He saw her coming and read her face before she said anything and brought the horse to the fence. "What happened?" he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she could see him processing it, the additional document Blackwood was fabricating, what it meant, what it changed. "He's going to try to bury you before you can speak," he said. "That's what he tried to do in the street," she said. "He wants to establish the narrative before I have a chance to present the counter-evidence." "Then we change the sequence," Ethan said. "We don't wait for his meeting." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean we get to Franklin Price first. Today, if the road allows." He tied the young horse and came through the gate. "If you have a lawyer who's looked at that original document before Blackwood's meeting, you walk in there with a legal opinion already in hand. He can't bury what's already been seen." She stared at him. "You said Millerton is 30 miles. It's 28. We can make it by late afternoon if we leave in the next hour." "Ethan, you told me not to stand in your way," he said. "I'm not standing in your way. I'm handing you a faster road." He met her eyes directly. "You said Blackwood is going to try to come between us. Well, let's not give him the time." She held his gaze. Then she said, "I'll get the documents." They made Millerton in 4 hours, pushing harder than was comfortable. Franklin Price's office was on the second floor of a brick building near the courthouse. A small space with tall shelves and a desk buried under papers, and a man behind it who looked about 60, with sharp eyes behind wire spectacles and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that urgency properly applied works better than panic. He read every document Clara laid before him without speaking. He took his time. He turned pages back, checked dates, ran a finger along the notary stamp on the original document. He read her 2-page summary. Then he looked up. "This is fraud," he said. "Clean and provable." "That's what I thought," Clara said. "You have the original loan document with his signature. You have 3 years of payment receipts bearing the bank's own stamp at the original rate. And the document he presented after your mother's death shows different terms, same original date, and no second notary stamp." He set the papers down. He didn't get a notary on the altered version because he didn't think he'd need to. He thought the original was gone. "He thought I didn't know about the chest," Clara said. "Lucky for you." Price looked at Ethan. "And you're the husband." "I am," Ethan said. "Then you have an interest too. The property Blackwood auctioned, he can auction stolen property, but the title doesn't clear." He looked back at Clara. "If you pursue this, and we win, and I believe we would win, the house reverts to you as your mother's legal heir. What Blackwood received at auction, he would owe back plus penalties." He folded his hands. "This goes federal. Land fraud at this scale with documentary evidence is a federal matter. I have contacts in Helena." Clara sat very still. "Federal," she said. "Federal," Price confirmed. "Which means Blackwood's meeting day after tomorrow is not the arena you want to fight in. His meeting is designed to let him control the terms. The arena you want is a federal inquiry where he has no terms to offer." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "How long does a federal inquiry take to start? If I send a wire to Helena tonight, I can have a contact respond within 48 hours. The inquiry itself—" Price made a considering gesture. "Weeks, possibly months. But once it starts, Blackwood is not going to be able to operate as he currently does. His accounts will be under scrutiny. His current contracts will be questioned. Every deed transfer he's made in the last 10 years will get a second look." Clara thought about Margaret Cooley. There are people in this town who know Thomas Blackwood has been doing this for years. They've been too afraid. "How many people do you think he's done this to?" she asked Price. In my experience, Price looked at her steadily. A man who does this once does it often. The method is too clean, and the return's too good for it to be a single case. He paused. If others come forward, if others have documentation or even testimony, the case becomes significantly stronger. They'll be afraid, Clara said. Yes, people usually are. Until someone else isn't afraid first. He looked at her. That appears to be you. She looked at the documents on his desk. 3 years of her mother's careful handwriting. $14 every month. Never late, never missing. Send the wire, she said. Price nodded and began writing immediately. On the road back to the ranch, the sun was going down, and the mountains were going purple, and Ethan drove, and Clara sat beside him, with the cedar chest documents back in the envelope on her lap. And for a while, neither of them said anything. Then Clara said, "He's going to know it was me who went to Price. He's going to know I moved first." "Yes," Ethan said. "That changes the meeting day after tomorrow. He won't come in with the pleasant approach anymore. He'll come in angry." "Probably. And he's going to look at you and try to decide if you're someone who can be reasoned with separately. He's going to try to make you think I'm more trouble than I'm worth." She looked at the road. "Because that's what a man like him does. He tries to separate people." Ethan drove in silence for a moment. "Clara," he said. "Yes, I know what you're doing. You're getting out ahead of the possibility that I might decide this situation isn't what I agreed to." He glanced at her sidelong. "That I might look at a federal inquiry and a man like Blackwood turning his attention this way and decide the northern quarter section isn't worth it." She didn't answer. "I didn't agree to this arrangement because it was easy," he said. "I agreed to it because I needed someone who could hold their ground. You have held your ground since the moment I saw you standing in that street." He looked back at the road. "I'm not going to let a man like Thomas Blackwood make me question my own judgment." The words settled into the evening air. "That's the most you've said to me at one time," she said. "Don't get used to it," he said. She turned her face away so he wouldn't see her almost smile. "I won't," she said. They got back to the ranch after dark. Holt had kept supper warm. The hands were already in the bunkhouse. The ranch was quiet, and the mountains were invisible in the dark, but still present the way big things are, even when you can't see them. After supper, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table with a clean sheet of paper and wrote out 2 more copies of her summary. The discrepancies, the dates, the document numbers. 1 copy for her, 1 copy for Price, 1 to leave with Margaret Cooley, because federal inquiries took time and documents could be lost. Her mother had taught her that. She heard Ethan's boots in the hallway slowing near the kitchen door. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll sleep when I'm finished." A pause. "What are you making extra copies for?" "Because Blackwood already lost 1 original document. I'd rather not give him the chance to lose another." His footsteps stopped entirely. She didn't look up. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "He's going to push hard." "I know. It's going to get worse before it gets better." "I know that too." She looked up then and met his eyes across the kitchen. "Are you asking if I'm ready?" He held her gaze. "I'm asking if you know what you're walking into." "I know exactly what I'm walking into," she said. "I've known since the day I read that second document and realized what he'd done. I just didn't have any way to fight it until—" She stopped. "Until now," he said quietly. "Until now," she agreed. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he said, "Don't stay up too late," and walked back down the hallway. She listened to his footsteps go, and then she turned back to her paper, and she wrote carefully and precisely in the lamplight, every word exactly right. Outside, the mountains waited in the dark. Tomorrow, Thomas Blackwood was going to wake up and find out that his carefully laid plan had a problem. The woman he'd expected to be gone was still here. She had a lawyer in Millerton. She had a husband who wasn't moving. And she had her mother's chest full of 40 years of careful proof. She finished the last copy, capped the ink, and blew out the lamp. She was ready. The morning of the meeting, Clara was dressed and downstairs before Garrett had the coffee on. She sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of her and her hands flat on the wood, and she breathed slowly and deliberately, the way her mother had taught her, in through the nose, out through the mouth, and think about what you know, not what you're afraid of. What she knew, she had the original loan document. She had 3 years of payment receipts. She had Franklin Price's written opinion, which had arrived by Ryder late the previous afternoon, 4 pages in a careful legal hand, confirming fraud under Montana territorial statute, and noting that a federal wire had been sent to Helena. What she was afraid of, that she had moved too fast, that Blackwood had resources she hadn't anticipated, that when they walked into that bank this morning, something would happen that no amount of documentation could stop. She pushed the fear back down and picked up her coffee. Ethan came in at 6:30. He looked at her and at the envelope and sat down across from her without comment. Garrett put coffee in front of him and left them alone. "Price's letter," she said, sliding a copy across the table. "Read it." He read it. His expression didn't change much, but she had spent enough days now watching his face to catch the slight tightening around his eyes when he got to the federal wire section. "He moves quickly," Ethan said. "He said the evidence was unusually clean." She took the letter back. "He also said something else. Last night after the Ryder left, I went back through the cedar chest again." She paused. "I found other names." Ethan set his coffee down. "My mother kept letters," Clara said, "from other people in town, women mostly. A few of them mentioned the bank, mentioned Blackwood, mentioned terms that changed without explanation." She met his eyes. She was collecting it. She knew what was happening to her wasn't only happening to her. She just didn't know how to fight it. The silence in the kitchen had weight to it. "How many names?" Ethan asked. "4 that are clear. Possibly 2 more if the letters mean what I think they mean." She folded her hands on the table. "Margaret Cooley knows these families. She can reach them quietly. If even 2 of them are willing to come forward." "Then it's not just your mother's case," Ethan said. "It's a pattern." Price said a pattern makes it federal automatically. She looked at him steadily. "This is bigger than I thought when I started." He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him think, the way his jaw set slightly, and his eyes went inward, and she had come to understand that when he got that look, he was not retreating. He was deciding. "Then we go in knowing it's bigger," he said. "And we don't show Blackwood we know." She nodded. "Agreed." They left for Red Hollow at 9. The drive was mostly quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, the kind of quiet between people who have said what needed saying and are now simply in the same space, which is its own kind of closeness. Clara held the envelope in both hands and watched the road. Ethan drove with the same unhurried steadiness he brought to everything. Halfway to town, he said without looking at her, "Whatever happens in there, follow my lead if I move. I'll do the same for you." "All right," she said. "And if he comes at you directly?" "I won't react," she said. "I know." "That's not what I was going to say." He glanced at her sideways. "I was going to say, if he comes at you directly, don't hold back. You're better with words than he is. Use it." She looked at him. He looked back at the road. She turned forward again. "All right," she said differently than before. Thomas Blackwood's bank was the largest building on Main Street, 2 stories of red brick, with the name stenciled in gold letters above the door, and a pair of potted plants flanking the entrance that were watered every single day by someone whose entire job seemed to be keeping Thomas Blackwood's front steps looking prosperous. Silas Vance was waiting outside when they arrived. He was a thin man with a careful suit and the watchful eyes of someone who had built a career on noticing things other people missed. He looked at Clara, and then at Ethan, and then back at Clara. "Mr. Callahan," he said. Mrs. Callahan." The slight hesitation was deliberate. "Vance," Ethan said, "Mr. Blackwood is ready for you." They went in. The inside of the bank smelled like wood polish and paper and the particular coolness of a thick-walled building in summer. There were 2 tellers behind the counter who both looked up and then looked quickly away when Clara made eye contact. Behind a glass partition at the back, she could see a door that led to Blackwood's private office. Vance led them through. Blackwood was standing when they entered, which was a choice. It put him at a social advantage over people who had just sat down from a long drive and were still finding their footing in the room. He was impeccably dressed, silver-haired gold watch chain catching the light. He had the pleasant smile on, but it sat on his face differently today. There was effort behind it. "Ethan," he said. "And Clara." "First names, no titles, another choice." "Mr. Blackwood," Clara said. She sat down without waiting to be invited. Ethan remained standing. Blackwood looked at Ethan for a moment, and then decided to sit as well, because the alternative was a standing conversation with a man who was several inches taller than him and showed no signs of discomfort about it. "I appreciate you both coming in," Blackwood said. "I hope we can speak plainly here without—" He paused. "Without the kind of public drama we had last week." "Of course," Clara said. "Good." He folded his hands on the desk. "Clara, I understand that you've been under considerable stress. Losing your mother is never easy, and the financial realities that follow a loss like that can be overwhelming. I want you to know that my bank has always tried to work with families in difficult situations." "That's kind of you," Clara said. He waited for more, and when there wasn't more, he continued. "With that in mind, I wanted to speak to you about the property on Birch Lane. Obviously, the auction has proceeded legally, but given the circumstances, given that you grew up in that home, I think it would be reasonable to offer a modest sum. A gesture of good faith. Something to help you and your husband start your life together without this unpleasantness hanging over things." He named a number. It was small. It was the kind of number a man names when he's establishing the lowest possible starting point. Clara said nothing. Ethan said nothing. Blackwood's pleasant expression held, but his hands moved slightly on the desk, one finger tapping once and stopping. "I think," Clara said finally, "that before we discuss any offers, I should share something with you." She opened the envelope and took out the original loan document and placed it on the desk between them. Blackwood looked at it. His face didn't move. "This is the original loan document my mother signed in March of 1875, Clara said. "The repayment schedule, as you can see, is $14 per month for 8 years. I also have—" She placed the stack of receipts beside it. "3 years of payment records, each one bearing your bank's stamp at the original rate." She placed Price's letter on top. "And this is a legal opinion from Franklin Price of Millerton, who has reviewed these documents and has identified material discrepancies between the original terms and the document your bank presented to me 6 weeks after my mother's death." The room was very quiet. "Mr. Price," she continued, "has also sent a wire to a federal contact in Helena as the nature of the discrepancies places this matter under territorial fraud statute." She folded her hands in her lap. "I wanted to share that with you before we discussed any offers." Silas Vance, who had been standing near the door, had gone very still. Blackwood looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he looked up at Clara. The pleasant smile was gone. Not replaced by anger, replaced by something colder and more careful. "That document," he said, "could have come from anywhere. The notary stamp in the corner is dated March 12, 1875, Clara said. "Henry Marsh was the county notary at that time. He's retired now, but he still lives on Creek Road. I expect he keeps records." Blackwood's jaw tightened slightly. "As do the payment receipts," she said. "Your bank's stamp is on each one. The teller's initials are on each one. Different initials for different months, because different tellers handled different days." She paused. "Those tellers still work here." A long silence. Then Blackwood said, "What is it you want, Clara?" "My mother's name cleared," she said. "The house returned to her estate, of which I am the sole heir. Restitution of the auction proceeds to the estate, and an accounting of every loan transaction your bank has conducted in the last 10 years under amended terms." Something moved behind Blackwood's eyes. "That last request is—" "Not a request," she said. It's what a federal inquiry will require. I'm simply telling you what's coming." Blackwood turned to Ethan. "Ethan," he said, and his voice changed register lower, more man-to-man, the voice of someone who expected to find a different kind of listener. "You've been in this county your whole life. Your father was in this county his whole life. We've had our differences, but we understand each other. This woman—" He stopped, recalibrated. "Your wife is making accusations that are going to create a great deal of disruption for a great many people. For you as well. The Callahan Ranch has water rights that run through county-administered land. Credit arrangements that my bank has historically—" "Are you threatening my husband's water rights?" Clara said, "in order to persuade him to ask me to stop pursuing fraud charges against you?" Blackwood looked at her sharply. "Because if so," she said, "that's a separate matter that Mr. Price will also find interesting." Ethan spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. "Blackwood," he said, and his voice was very quiet and very level. "I've sat here, and I've listened, and I want to be clear with you. Whatever you think about the nature of my marriage, or about what leverage you have over me, or about how much trouble this is going to cause, you're going to want to rethink your position before Helena responds to that wire." Blackwood stared at him. "Because right now," Ethan said, "you're talking to two people. In a few weeks you're going to be talking to the federal government, and they are going to ask the same questions she just asked, and they're going to ask them a lot less politely." He stood. "We're done for today." Clara gathered the document, stood, and walked out of the office ahead of him. She made it all the way to the wagon before her hands started shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed and got control of it before Ethan came around to his side. He climbed up and took the reins, and they drove out of town without speaking, and she got her hands to stop shaking entirely before they reached the edge of Main Street. "You did well," he said when they were clear of town. "I didn't say half of what I wanted to say." "I know. That's what did well means." She looked at him. He was watching the road. "He's going to move quickly now," she said. "He knows we went to Price before the meeting. He's going to try to get ahead of the federal inquiry." "What can he do?" "Discredit the documents. Find someone to testify that the original was forged. Try to settle with Price's contact before a formal inquiry is opened if he can find the right person to pay." She paused. "Or he goes after the other names." Ethan's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "What other names?" "The families from my mother's letters. If he finds out I know about them, if he reaches them before I do and frightens them into silence." She stopped. "I need to talk to Margaret today." "We'll go to Margaret today." She turned to look at him. "You don't have to come." "I know," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. "Thank you," she said, "for what you said in there. I meant it. I know you did. That's why I'm thanking you." He glanced at her briefly. And then he looked back at the road, and she saw the very slight change in his expression. Something that wasn't quite ease, but was close to it, the way a man looks when he's said the right thing, and knows it, and doesn't quite know what to do with knowing it. Margaret coolly took one look at Clara's face when they walked into the dry goods and pulled her straight into the back room. Clara told her about the letters, the other names. Margaret's expression moved through surprise and then recognition, and then something harder and more resolved. "Ruth Haney," Margaret said. "She sold her cattle operation 2 years ago for less than half its value because the bank told her she owed money she didn't think she owed. She moved to Billings. She's still there." She listed 3 more names, 2 still in the county, 1 who had left. "They know something wasn't right. Every single one of them. They just didn't have what you have." "I need to reach them before Blackwood does," Clara said. "I'll ride to the Haney place tomorrow morning," Margaret said. "And I'll send word to the Connolly family on the South Fork." She paused. "Clara, when this comes out, when the federal inquiry starts, this town is going to split right down the middle. Half these people have done business with Blackwood for 20 years. They're not going to want to believe it." "I know," Clara said. "Are you ready for that?" Clara thought about her mother's rocking chair in the dirt. About $14 every month faithfully for 3 years, stamped and dated and initialed, filed in a cedar chest with "Do Not Lose" underlined twice. "I was ready for it 6 weeks ago," she said. "I just didn't have the tools yet." They drove back to the ranch in the long summer afternoon, and Clara sat with the envelope in her lap and thought about all the moving parts and how fast she needed to move them. She didn't hear from Price for 2 days. Those 2 days were the worst kind of waiting, the kind where you've done everything you can do, and now you're dependent on other people's timelines, and all you can do is keep working and try not to think about what might be happening in Helena or in Blackwood's back office, or in the homes of the families her mother had written letters about. She threw herself into the ranch accounts. The books were genuinely a mess, not through dishonesty, but through neglect and a system that had been invented by a man who knew cattle and horses better than he knew numbers, and had simply continued doing things the same way because they mostly worked. Clara reorganized everything. She found 2 vendor overcharges that had been quietly recurring for months. She found a grazing lease that had lapsed without anyone noticing and needed to be renewed before fall, or the northern meadow would be unavailable. She brought it all to Ethan in the evening. He looked at the overcharges and his jaw went tight. "How long has that been happening?" "At least 8 months on the feed supplier. Possibly longer. I can only go back to where the receipts start." "I'll deal with it." "I already wrote the letter," she said. "You just need to sign it." He looked at her. "You can change it if you want," she said. "But I think it says what needs to be said." He read the letter. He picked up the pen and signed it without changing a word. She took it back and set it with the outgoing correspondence, and when she looked up, he was still watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked back at the table. "The grazing lease, when does it need to be filed?" 2 weeks. "I'll ride to the land office Monday." "I can come." "I know you can." There was a pause that wasn't quite the same as the other pauses. "Holt told me," Ethan said, "that Will has been talking about how the feed ratios are better since you went over them with him. The ratios weren't difficult. He just needed someone to show him the calculation. He's been here 4 years. I never thought to show him." He was looking at the table. I'm not good at that. Teaching things, explaining things." "You're better than you think," she said. He looked up, and there it was again, that unguarded thing moving too quickly to catch fully. "What makes you say that?" "The way you work with the horses," she said simply. "You don't tell them what to do. You show them what's possible, and then you wait." The room was very quiet. "You've been watching me with the horses," he said. "I've been watching how you do everything," she said, and then realized how that sounded, and kept her voice steady, because the alternative was letting something shift in a direction she wasn't ready to examine. "It's practical. I'm learning how the ranch works." He held her gaze for a moment. "Right," he said. "Practical." He stood and took his cup to the kitchen, and she listened to his footsteps, and then the creak of the back door, and she sat very still for a moment, and looked at the account books, and told herself that what was happening was a business arrangement and a legal necessity, and not anything else, and she almost convinced herself. The letter from Price arrived on the 3rd day. Holt brought it up from the road at breakfast and set it on the table in front of Clara without comment. She opened it while Ethan was still drinking his coffee. She read it once, then she read it again. "Price's federal contact has confirmed the inquiry," she said. "It opens formally next week. They've requested all documentation I have, plus anything the county recorder's office holds on Blackwood's bank transactions over the last 12 years. She looked up. "And they've issued a hold on any asset transfers from Blackwood Savings and Loan pending investigation." Ethan set his cup down. "He can't move money," she said. "He can't transfer properties. He can't settle anything or sell anything until the inquiry clears it." She heard her own voice and was surprised by how calm it was. "It's working." "It's working," Ethan said. She looked back at the letter, and then, without entirely meaning to, she said, "My mother would have been—" She stopped. Ethan was quiet, then. "She spent 3 years paying that bank," Clara said. "Every month, $14. She never missed. She never complained. She She trusted that if you did the right thing and kept your records clean, that would be enough. She pressed her fingers flat against the letter. It wasn't enough, but she kept the records anyway. And now those records are the thing that... She stopped again. The kitchen was very warm, and the light was coming through the window, and somewhere outside Will was talking to one of the other hands, and a horse was moving in the corral. She was right, Ethan said. About the records, she just needed someone to use them. Clara looked at him. She raised someone who knew how, he said. She breathed in slow and deliberate the way her mother had taught her. Yes, she said. She did. She folded the letter and stood up and said she needed to take a copy to Margaret. And she went to get her coat, and if her eyes were bright for a moment in the hallway, no one was there to see it. But she had been gone from the kitchen less than 2 minutes when Holt came back in the back door with a different expression, quick and tight around the eyes, again, the same look he'd had when he brought the first message from Blackwood. "Rider at the road," he said. "Different one this time, not Blackwood's man." Ethan stood. "Who?" Said his name is Garrett Cole. Says he works for the county recorder's office. Holt's voice was careful. Says he needs to speak to Clara. Says it's about the inquiry. Clara came back into the kitchen doorway, coat half on. "What does the county recorder's office want with me?" she said. Man wouldn't say much, just that there's a complication. Holt looked at her steadily. Said it's about the original loan document. The room went very quiet. "What kind of complication?" Ethan asked. He said... Holt paused. He said there's already a copy of the original loan document on file with the recorder's office, filed 3 days ago. Clara froze. "That's not possible," she said. "I have the original. It was in the cedar chest. He says the copy on file shows different terms than the copy you gave Price." Holt looked at her. "He says it's dated the same day, same notary stamp." The silence stretched. "He forged a second original," Ethan said. "He can't," Clara said, but her voice had changed. "The notary stamp, Henry Marsh." "Henry Marsh passed away," Holt said quietly. 14 days ago. His daughter posted notice last week." The air went out of the room. Clara stood very still, and the implications moved through her one by one, fast and cold. The notary who had witnessed the original signing was dead. Blackwood had filed a forged copy with the county recorder, a copy that showed different terms 3 days ago, before the inquiry hold was in place, but after she'd shown him the original in his office. He had known she had the original. He had moved in the window between their meeting and the federal hold being issued. He hadn't panicked. He had planned. "He was ready for this," she said. "He knew he's known someone might come at him with documentation. He had a contingency." She put one hand flat on the kitchen doorframe. "He had a forged copy ready to file." "Can Price fight it?" Ethan asked. "2 competing originals with the same notary stamp and the notary deceased," she said. "Yes, Price can fight it, but it's no longer clean. It's no longer one fraudulent document against one genuine one. It's one genuine one against one forged one, and a dead man who can't tell the difference." "The payment receipts," Ethan said. "Still good, still solid. But they prove she paid. They don't prove the terms she was paying under." She turned to look at him. "He's trying to muddy the water, make it complicated enough that a federal inquiry takes longer and costs more, and people give up." Ethan looked at her. "You're not going to give up." "No," she said, "but I need to think." She went to the front room and she sat and she thought, hard and fast and without sentiment. The forged document was filed with the county recorder. 2 competing originals, notary dead. What remained that Blackwood couldn't touch the payment receipts, the tellers who had stamped them, the families from her mother's letters, Ruth Haney, the Connollys, the others. People who had been through the same process. People who might have their own documentation. And there was one more thing. She sat up. The original loan document had a notary stamp. But it also had something else. Something she hadn't thought about because she hadn't needed to yet. In the corner of the original below the notary stamp, her mother had written something in pencil. A small notation, almost invisible. Clara had seen it when she went through the document the first time and hadn't understood what it meant. RM present, JT present, initials, 2 people. Present at the signing, witnesses. Not the notary witnesses. Her mother had written them down because her mother wrote everything down. RM Rachel Marsh, Henry Marsh's wife. JT. She didn't know yet, but she would find out. She stood up and went back to the kitchen. Ethan was still there. "I know what we need to do," she said. He looked at her. "Tell me." "My mother didn't just have the notary at the signing. She had witnesses. She wrote their initials on the original document. Henry Marsh is gone, but his wife is still alive. And if Rachel Marsh was present at the signing, if she remembers it, she can testify to the original terms regardless of what Blackwood files with the county recorder." Ethan straightened. "And there's a second initial," Clara said. "JT, I need to find out who that is. If both witnesses are alive and willing..." She stopped. "This gets undone. Everything he built around the forged copy gets undone." Ethan reached for his hat. "Where are you going?" she said. "Rachel Marsh lives on the east side of town." He settled the hat. "Henry Marsh and my father went to church together for 15 years. She knows me." He looked at Clara. "She'll talk to me." Clara stared at him for a moment. "You know where she lives," she said. "I know where most people in this county live," he said. "I've been here my whole life. I just don't usually go visiting." He moved toward the door. "Are you coming?" She grabbed the envelope from the table. "Yes," she said. "I'm coming." They were out the door and to the wagon before the rider from the county recorder's office had made it halfway up the road to the house. Whatever Blackwood had planned for the next move, he was going to have to make it faster. Because Clara Whitfield was not waiting for him to get there first. Not today. Not ever again. Rachel Marsh answered the door before they knocked. She was 71 years old, small and white-haired, with the kind of stillness that comes from a life spent paying attention. She looked at Ethan first. Recognition moving across her face, and then at Clara, and then at the envelope in Clara's hands, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise. More like arrival. Like she had been expecting something, and wasn't entirely certain whether to be relieved or afraid that it had finally come. "Ethan Callahan," she said. "I haven't seen you since your father's funeral." "Mrs. Marsh," he said. "I'm sorry about Henry." She nodded once, accepting that, and stepped back from the door. "Come in." The front room was small and neat, and full of the quiet particular to houses where someone has recently died. A heaviness in the air, things not yet moved back to their proper places. Rachel Marsh sat in the chair nearest the window and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Clara. "You're Eleanor Whitfield's daughter," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You have her eyes." She paused. "I heard what happened. With the bank. With the auction." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I'm sorry about your mother. She was a good woman." "She was," Clara said. "Mrs. Marsh, I found the original loan document in her cedar chest, and in the corner of the document she wrote 2 sets of initials, R.M. and J.T. She looked at the older woman steadily. "Were you present at the signing?" Rachel Marsh was quiet for a long moment. "Henry was the notary," she said. "That was his job. I didn't usually go with him to signings." She looked down at her hands. "But your mother called me that morning. She said she was nervous. She didn't like signing things she didn't fully understand, and she wanted a friend there." She lifted her eyes. "So I went." Clara's heart was moving fast, but her face was still. "And the terms?" $14 a month, Rachel Marsh said without hesitation. 8 years. I remember because your mother asked Henry to read the schedule twice, and he did. She wanted to be sure she understood exactly what she owed and when. A pause. She was that kind of woman. Yes, Clara said. She was. The document Blackwood is now claiming is the original, Clara said carefully. Shows a different schedule. $22 a month. Retroactive from the start. Rachel Marsh's hands, which had been still pressed together. That is not what Henry notarized, she said. Her voice was flat and final as a door closing. I was there. I know what was signed. Would you be willing to say that? Clara asked. Formally, to a federal inquiry. The silence that followed was long enough that Clara became aware of everything in the room, the clock ticking, Ethan standing slightly behind her, the quality of the older woman's breathing. Henry knew, Rachel Marsh said quietly. That's what you should understand. He didn't know what Blackwood had done. He didn't know until a few months before he died. When he started hearing things, when people started talking about changed terms and lost documents. She looked up. He couldn't prove it because the signed document had already been replaced, but he knew. And she stopped. It was hard on him, knowing that his stamp was on what Blackwood had done. Your husband's stamp is also on the real document, Clara said. The one my mother kept. The one that says $14 a month. Something moved in Rachel Marsh's face, a loosening small but real. He'd want me to say yes, she said. I know he would. Then you'll speak to the inquiry. I'll speak to whoever needs to hear it. She straightened in her chair. Now tell me who JT is. I don't know yet, Clara said. I was hoping you might. Rachel Marsh thought for a moment. Jacob Trent, she said. He was in the office that morning. Henry's assistant at the time. Young man, 22-23. He witnessed several signings that year. She paused. He left Red Hollow 2 years ago, moved to Butte. Do you know if he's still there? His sister is married to the Peterson boy on Creek Road. She'd know where to find him. Clara looked at Ethan. Ethan was already putting on his hat. They were back in the wagon 10 minutes after they'd arrived. Clara sat with the envelope pressed flat against her knee and ran the sequence through her mind. Rachel Marsh's testimony, Jacob Trent in Butte. The payment receipts the other families her mother had written letters about. Each piece was solid on its own. Together, they were something Blackwood couldn't forge his way out of. You know what this means, she said as they turned toward Creek Road. It means his forged copy falls apart, Ethan said. It means more than that. She looked at him. If Rachel Marsh testifies, and if Jacob Trent can be found and confirms the same terms, Blackwood didn't just change one document. He changed a notarized document with a living witness. That's not just fraud. She let that land. That's perjury. That's obstruction. That's a federal case that doesn't settle quietly. Ethan drove for a moment. He must have known the risk when he filed that copy. He was betting that Rachel Marsh wouldn't talk, Clara said. He was betting she was old and grieving and wouldn't want to spend her husband's death fighting his bank. She paused. He underestimated her the same way he underestimated my mother. He has a habit of underestimating women, Ethan said. Men like him usually do, Clara said. It's the most useful thing about them. The Peterson place on Creek Road was a working farm with a kitchen full of children and a woman named Dora, who had her brother's location written down on a piece of paper that she produced from a Bible in the front room in under 2 minutes, as though she had kept it handy for a reason she couldn't quite have named. Jacob Trent was in Butte. Working at the assay office. Dora had a forwarding address. Clara wrote it down and thanked her, and they left. In the wagon, she wrote a letter to Jacob Trent right there on her knee, using the back of the envelope as a surface, because she didn't want to lose the hour it would take to get back to the ranch and write it properly. She told him what she had. She told him what she needed. She told him about Rachel Marsh. She kept it short and clear the way her father had taught her to write. Say what you mean, then stop. She handed it to Ethan. Can you send this from town? He read it. I'll take it to the telegraph office and wire Price as well. He looked at her. You're moving fast. I have to. Every day Blackwood has to work with is a day he uses. She took the letter back and folded it. He has money and he has time. The only advantage I have is that he thinks I'm still reacting to him. I need to stay ahead. You are ahead. Ethan said. Not until the inquiry opens formally, she said. Until then, anything can happen. They split at the edge of town, Ethan to the telegraph office, Clara to Margaret's dry goods. Margaret had news of her own. She had reached Ruth Haney by letter 2 days earlier. Ruth Haney had written back in less than 24 hours, with 4 pages of documentation, her own payment records, her own loan papers, her own account of the conversation in which Blackwood's man had presented new terms after the fact. Her letter was sitting on Margaret's counter, and Clara read it standing up in under 5 minutes, and by the time Ethan found her there, she had read it twice. It's the same pattern, she said when he walked in. Same method, different names, same bank stamp, same forged terms. She held up Ruth Haney's letter. Except Ruth Haney is not a woman who gives up easily either. She kept everything. How many is that now? Margaret asked. Including your mother. 3 confirmed, Clara said. Possibly 2 more if I can reach the families before the end of the week. Margaret leaned on the counter. Clara, I've been thinking. She glanced at Ethan and then back at Clara. There's going to be a town meeting. Blackwood has already put out word he wants to address the community about what he's calling unfounded accusations from outside agitators. He's scheduled it for Friday evening at the grain exchange. Clara looked at her. Outside agitators. You've only lived here your whole life, Margaret said dryly. When did he put that out? This morning, right after the news about the federal hold started going around. Margaret paused. Word travels fast in this town. People know the hold is on. Half of them have loans through his bank. They're scared. If they're scared, they'll want to believe him, Clara said. Some of them will, Margaret agreed. But some of them... She stopped and looked at her hands for a moment. Some of them are scared of him, Clara. That's different from believing him. And if someone stands up in that room on Friday and says clearly what you're saying, clearly with documentation behind it. She looked up. I think some of those scared people might find they're less scared than they thought. The room was quiet. You think I should go to the meeting, Clara said. I think if you don't go, he owns the room, Margaret said simply. Clara looked at Ethan. He looked at her. It's your call, he said. I'll be there either way. She took a breath. I'll be there. The next 2 days were the hardest kind of waiting, but Clara didn't let herself wait. She organized. She wrote letters. She went through the Connolly family situation with the same methodical precision she'd brought to her mother's documents, and the Connollys, a husband and wife in their 50s, who had lost a small cattle operation 2 years back under circumstances that had never quite made sense to them, sat at their own kitchen table across from her and Ethan, and laid out what they remembered, and it matched. Not identically, but structurally. The same progression, the same changed terms, the same timing always after a death or a family illness, or a moment when someone was least able to fight back. He waited, the Connolly wife said. She was a quiet woman who had been quiet throughout most of the conversation, and when she spoke, everyone in the room paid attention. He always waits, until you're already on your knees, and then he tells you that you owe more than you thought. Clara drove home that evening and thought about what the Connolly wife had said, and about her mother making payments every month in a house that was already legally being taken from her by a man who was simply waiting for the right moment to say so. She thought about it, and then she put it away and focused on what she was going to say on Friday. Ethan found her in the front room at 11 o'clock that night, still working. You should sleep, he said. I know. You said that last time and then you didn't. She looked up. He was leaning in the doorframe, the same doorframe he'd stood in that first evening when they'd made their arrangement, and she had learned by now that doorframes were where he stood when he wasn't sure whether to come in or stay out. It was she had decided something she found oddly endearing, which was information she had no particular use for. I'm almost finished, she said. He pushed off the doorframe and came in and sat down across from her. Uninvited the way he'd started doing in the last few days, quietly claiming the space across from her as a natural place to be without calling attention to the change. Tell me what you're going to say on Friday, he said. You want to hear it? I want to make sure there are no holes in it. You've been inside it too long to see them yourself." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned her notes around so he could read them. He read slowly and carefully. He asked 2 questions. One about the sequence of events she planned to present. One about the Haney documentation. And both questions were exactly the right questions, the gaps she hadn't noticed because she'd been living with the material for weeks. She answered both, adjusted her notes. "One more thing," he said. "What?" "Don't make it about you," he said. "I know that sounds wrong, but when you stand up in that room, if they think it's a personal grudge, a daughter fighting for her mother, he can make it look like grief, like you're not thinking clearly." She held still. "Make it about the pattern," he said. "Make it about Ruth Haney and the Connollys and the other families. Make it about what's been happening to people in this county for years. Your mother is the proof, not the point." He paused. "The point is that it happened to all of them, and it could happen to anyone in that room." Clara looked at him across the table. "That," she said, "is exactly right." He leaned back. "Told you there were holes. You were right." She picked up her pencil. "Thank you." He didn't leave. He sat there while she rewrote the opening of her notes, and she was aware of him in the way she had become accustomed to being aware of him steadily. The way you're aware of good solid ground under your feet. And she wrote cleanly, and didn't think about that, and was grateful for the lamp and the work. Jacob Trent's response came Thursday morning by telegraph, short, clear, and better than she'd hoped. He remembered the signing. He remembered the terms. He remembered Eleanor Whitfield asking for the schedule to be read twice. He had left his own copy of his witness notes in his personal files in Butte, which he'd kept because Henry Marsh had taught him to keep records of everything. He would send a sworn statement to Franklin Price within 48 hours. Clara read the telegram at the kitchen table, and set it down, and pressed her palms flat on the wood, and breathed. Ethan was watching her. "Trent has his own notes," she said. "From the day of the signing. He kept records." Something moved in Ethan's face. "Then Blackwood has nothing." "He has the forged copy with the recorder," she said. "But with Rachel Marsh, Jacob Trent, and 3 years of payment receipts—" She stopped. "He has nothing." Ethan stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she understood that he was doing what he did when things landed harder than expected, not falling apart, just absorbing. "It's almost over," she said. "Almost," he said. He turned. And then he said very quietly, "You did this." "My mother did this," Clara said. "She kept the records." "She kept the records," he agreed. "But you came back for them, when you had every reason to walk away and not look back." He held her gaze. "That took something most people don't have." The kitchen was warm, and the morning was coming through the window, and somewhere outside Holt was talking to Will, and the horses were moving, and everything was very ordinary and very present. "I had help," she said. He looked away, and she watched the line of his jaw, and she thought about what she wasn't saying, and decided today was not the day to say it. Friday evening arrived clear and warm, and the grain exchange in Red Hollow was full. Clara had not expected it to be that full. Every bench was taken. People stood along the walls. She recognized faces she'd known her whole life. Farmers, tradespeople, wives and husbands, and older women who had raised families in this county and built lives here, and who now sat in tight rows and looked at the front of the room where Thomas Blackwood stood, with his silver hair and his gold watch chain and his particular, confident stillness. Ethan walked in beside her. Not ahead of her. Not behind her. Beside. The room saw them come in. The murmur it produced was the complicated kind, not hostile, not welcoming. More like a held breath. Blackwood saw them too. His expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. They took a place along the wall. Margaret was already there, and beside her were the Connollys, and on the other side of the room, in seats they must have traveled to get to, were 2 people Clara didn't immediately recognize. A woman of about 50, with quiet eyes and a careful posture, and a man beside her who was holding his hat in his hands. Margaret caught Clara's eye and moved it toward the two strangers. Clara looked. The woman looked back. Ruth Haney, all the way from Billings. Clara's chest did something complicated, and she made it stop. Blackwood began to speak. He was good at it. She had known he would be. He was warm and reasonable and slightly wronged, the manner of a man who has been in this community for decades and is disappointed to find himself mischaracterized. He talked about the bank's history, about the families it had helped, about how an accusation, however unfounded, could damage the community trust that everyone in the room depended on. He talked about how grief could lead a good person to make accusations that weren't fair. He didn't say Clara's name. He didn't need to. Everyone knew who he was talking about. Several people in the room were nodding, and then Blackwood said, "I want to be transparent with this community. I want to share with you the documentation I have on file. The documentation that shows Eleanor Whitfield's original agreement with this bank. That document is forged." Clara said it clearly, and without heat, the way you state a fact that isn't personal, just true. The room went very still. Blackwood turned to look at her. "The document you filed with the county recorder 3 days ago is not the original," Clara said, and she stepped away from the wall and into the room, because this was not a conversation to have from the edges. "The original loan document is in the possession of Franklin Price of Millerton, confirmed by a federal legal opinion. The original shows a repayment schedule of $14 a month for 8 years. She looked at the room, not at Blackwood. "My mother paid that amount, every month, for 3 years. The payment receipts are stamped by this bank." Silence. "What Mr. Blackwood filed with the county recorder," she said, "shows different terms. Terms my mother never agreed to. I know this because I have 2 witnesses to the signing." She paused. Rachel Marsh, who was present at Henry Marsh's request, and Jacob Trent, who served as assistant notary and kept his own records. She looked at the room. "Rachel Marsh is prepared to testify. Jacob Trent has sent a sworn statement to Price in Millerton." A sound went through the room. Not one voice, many all at once. "Furthermore," Clara said, and now she did look at Blackwood just briefly, just long enough to be clear. "My mother was not the only person this was done to." She looked back at the room. Ruth Haney lost her cattle operation under the same method. The Connolly family on the South Fork. At least 3 others that I know of, and possibly more. She paused. "If you have ever had terms change on a loan from this bank after a death in your family, or a serious illness, or any moment when you were least able to pay attention, I am asking you to speak to Franklin Price. Because a federal inquiry is open, and what happened to my mother is documented, and it is not going to be buried." The room erupted. Not chaos, something more like a dam releasing. People talking to each other. People turning to look at the Connollys, at the woman standing near the wall, who was Ruth Haney, at Clara. Blackwood's voice rose over the noise. "This woman is making—" "I would be careful," said a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned. Margaret Cooley was standing with her arms crossed and her voice carrying easily over the crowd. "Because there are people in this room right now who know she's not wrong, and we've been quiet about it for too long." 3 seconds of silence. Then James Connolly stood up. Then his wife stood up beside him. Then an older man near the back. Clara didn't know him, got slowly to his feet, holding his hat, looking at the floor, and said in a rough voice, "My brother lost his farm in '75. Bank told him he'd missed payments he hadn't missed. He had the receipts. Nobody listened." The room was different after that. Blackwood was still there. His lawyer Vance was standing near the front with a face that had gone carefully blank. But the room had turned not all at once, but in pieces, the way things turn when truth works through a crowd, the way water works through rock, not fast, but unstoppable. Clara stood in the middle of it, and she let it happen around her, and she breathed slow and deliberate, and thought about $14 every month and a cedar chest, and a woman who wrote "Do not lose" and underlined it twice. Ethan was beside her. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't needed to. He was simply there, the way he'd been there, every time it counted, steady and present and not going anywhere. Blackwood left before the meeting formally ended. He walked out with Vance behind him, and the door of the grain exchange shut behind them, and the room exhaled. Margaret found Clara immediately after. "Ruth Haney wants to speak to you." Ruth Haney had the kind of face that had spent a lot of time in wind and sun, and not much time in self-pity. She shook Clara's hand with a firm grip and said, "I drove 20 hours to be here tonight." "I know," Clara said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Ruth said. "I've been waiting 2 years for someone to open this door. You opened it." She glanced at Ethan. "Both of you." Back to Clara. "I want to speak to Price. Whatever comes next, I want to be part of it." "I'll send him your name tonight," Clara said. Ruth nodded once, pressed Clara's hand again, and moved away toward the Connollys. The room was slowly emptying. People were talking in the doorway, and on the steps outside, the sound of a community that has been holding something in and is finally carefully beginning to let it out. Ethan stood beside Clara and watched the room clear. After a long while he said, "You changed something tonight." "We changed something tonight," she said. He was quiet. Then Clara, "Yes, when this is over." He stopped, started again. "When the inquiry is done and the case is settled." He looked at her. His expression was as open as she had ever seen it. All the careful flatness gone, just the man underneath. "What do you want?" She looked back at him. The room was nearly empty now. Someone had taken the lamp off the front table, and the light was dim and warm. "I want my mother's name cleared," she said. "And after that," she held his gaze. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I know I'm not going back to what it was before." He nodded slowly. "The ranch." He stopped. "You don't have to leave, you know that." "I know," she said. "I'm not saying it because of the land clause," he said, and his voice had changed quieter, stripped of its usual careful reserve. "I'm saying it because because it's better." He looked at the middle distance for a moment. "Everything is better." She looked at him for a long time. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "Take me home," she said. Something moved in his face, something warm and unguarded and real. "Yeah," he said. "All right." They walked out of the grain exchange together into the warm Montana night, and behind them, the door swung shut on Thomas Blackwood's version of Red Hollow. And ahead of them, the road ran north toward the mountains, toward the ranch, toward whatever came next, together. The ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the ones before. In the weeks since Clara had arrived at the Callahan ranch, she had learned to read the silences between herself and Ethan the way you learn to read weather. Each one had a texture, a pressure, a meaning underneath the absence of words. This one felt like the moment after a long storm passes, and the air is clean and very still, and you stand in it, and you don't quite know yet what the world looks like now, but you know it's different. She was still turning over what he'd said in the grain exchange. Everything is better. She had spent the ride from town holding those two words carefully, the way you hold something that might break if you grip it too hard, or drop it if you don't hold it hard enough. When they pulled into the ranch yard, Holt was still awake, sitting on the porch steps, with a cup of something that steamed in the night air. He looked at their faces when they climbed down, and said without preamble, "Well, the room turned," Ethan said. Holt looked at Clara. "You speak." "I spoke," she said. He nodded once. The Holt nod, which she had come to understand, conveyed more than most people's speeches. "Good," he said, and went back inside. Ethan unhitched the wagon, and she helped, working in the familiar rhythm they'd built over the past weeks, each knowing what the other was doing without needing to say it. When they were done, he stood with his hand on the horse's neck, and she stood on the other side, and the horse breathed between them. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. A pause. "You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say that tonight was the beginning, not the end. that the inquiry still has months to run, that Blackwood hasn't conceded anything and won't until he has to. She looked across the horse at him. And that we need to be careful until it's finished. He was quiet for a moment. That's most of it. What's the rest? He looked at her steadily. The rest isn't about Blackwood. She held his gaze and felt the warmth of it somewhere behind her sternum, specific and inconvenient. Go to bed, Ethan, she said not unkindly. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. She went inside and lay in the dark in the east room and listened to the ranch settle and the horses breathe. And she thought about her mother. And then she thought about the man on the other side of the wall. And she thought about the fact that she had come here as an arrangement and a legal necessity and had somehow built in the space of a few weeks something she didn't have a word for yet. She decided she didn't need a word for it tonight. She needed sleep. She slept better than she had since before her mother died. The next 3 weeks moved fast and hard. Franklin Price arrived in Red Hollow on the 9th day after the town meeting, accompanied by a federal investigator from Helena named Aldous Kemp, a compact, precise man of about 50 who wore a brown suit and carried a briefcase that seemed permanently attached to his right hand. He set up in Margaret Cooley's dry goods back room, which Margaret offered without being asked because she was Margaret Cooley, and that was the kind of woman she was. Kemp interviewed Clara first. He asked careful, thorough questions in a voice that gave nothing away, and she answered each one the same way, directly with documentation in hand, without elaboration or emotion. Price had coached her: say what you know, show what you have. Let the evidence speak. She showed him everything: the original loan document, the payment receipts, Price's legal opinion, Rachel Marsh's signed statement, Jacob Trent's sworn affidavit from Butte, Ruth Haney's documentation, the Connolly records. Kemp went through each item slowly and said very little. When he was finished, he looked at Clara across the table and said, Miss Whitfield, Mrs. Callahan, you've done thorough work. My mother did the work, she said. I just knew where to look. He studied her for a moment. You understand that this process will take time. I understand. And that Mr. Blackwood will contest every piece of this. I expect he will. And that there may be moments, there will likely be moments when it looks like he's winning. She looked at him. Mr. Kemp, I've been watching him look like he's winning since the day my mother died. I'm still here. Something shifted briefly in the investigator's expression, not a smile, but close. Yes, he said. You are. The investigation moved through Red Hollow like a slow flood quiet. At first, then everywhere at once. Kemp and his 2 assistants interviewed bank tellers, county recorder staff, every family that had brought forward documentation. They subpoenaed 12 years of Blackwood savings and loan records. They interviewed Silas Vance for 6 hours on a Wednesday, and by Thursday morning, Vance had retained his own lawyer, which told people everything they needed to know about how that interview had gone. Blackwood himself remained publicly composed. He kept the bank open. He kept his schedule. He was seen at church on Sundays and nodded to people on the street and maintained the careful dignity of a man who fully intended to prevail. But the hold on asset transfers remained in place, and the accounts under scrutiny were expanding, and the people who had been too afraid to speak were speaking one by one in the back room of Margaret Cooley's dry goods store. Clara drove into town 3 times a week. She brought documentation when it was needed, answered questions when Kemp had them, and on the days when she wasn't needed, she stayed at the ranch and worked. She had restructured the kitchen accounts entirely. She had renegotiated the feed contract. She had identified the grazing lease issue, and Ethan had ridden to the land office and renewed it before the fall deadline. She had found in the back of the account ledger a record of a debt that had been listed as outstanding for 4 years, and was on examination a clerical error. The payment had been made and simply never marked. Ethan had stared at the corrected ledger and said, 4 years I've been listing that as money I owe. You paid it in June of '74, she said. The receipt is in the file. It just wasn't transferred to the ledger. He had looked at the file and then at her and said, How long would I have carried that? Indefinitely, probably. Lord, he said quietly, which was about as close to an expression of strong feeling as she had heard from him in the ordinary course of things. She had laughed. It had come out before she decided to let it. He had looked at her with an expression that was surprised and warm and a little undone by it, and she had looked back at her ledger very quickly. Will had started bringing her questions without being asked. He'd come by the kitchen table in the evenings, with whatever calculation he'd been working on, and set it in front of her, not asking exactly, but in the vicinity of asking, and she'd go through it with him, and he'd leave, knowing more than he'd arrived with. Holt had noticed. He didn't say anything about it, but he'd started leaving coffee for her in the mornings, without being asked, which was Holt's version of an announcement. Garrett had given her the full kitchen ledger, without her requesting it. The ranch had absorbed her the way good soil absorbs water, quietly, completely, as though she had always been exactly what was needed there. She was aware of it happening. She was aware of what it meant. And she was aware with increasing specificity of Ethan Callahan, of the way he listened, when she spoke of the way he'd started leaving the front room lamp on later in the evenings, of the way his hands had brushed hers, once passing a document across the kitchen table, and neither of them had mentioned it. On a Tuesday morning in the 4th week of the investigation, she was in the barn with Will, going over feed records when Ethan came in from outside, with a look on his face she hadn't seen before. "Kemp wants us at Margaret's," he said. She looked at him. Now. She handed Will the ledger and followed Ethan out. They walked to the wagon, and he drove, and she watched his face and tried to read what that expression meant. He was tighter than usual, not the ordinary tightness, which was just how he was, but a different quality. Something between anticipation and something she couldn't name. "What did Kemp say?" she asked. "He said come now," Ethan said. "He didn't say why. That's not like him." "No," Ethan agreed. "It isn't." The dry goods back room was full when they arrived. Kemp, Price, Margaret, the Connollys, and Ruth Haney, who had evidently returned from Billings, and was standing against the back wall with her arms crossed, and the look of a woman who has been waiting a long time for something, and can now see it. Kemp looked at Clara when she walked in, and said without preamble, "We have Vance." The room was very quiet. "Silas Vance," Clara said. "He came in this morning." Kemp set a folder on the table. "He's prepared to provide full testimony in exchange for immunity. He was present when Blackwood ordered the alterations to Eleanor Whitfield's loan document. He was present for at least 4 others." He paused. "He kept records of his own. In the event I believe that he ever needed leverage." Clara sat down. She didn't plan to her legs, just decided. "He has written records," Price said carefully, "of the dates and specific terms of each alteration. In Blackwood's own handwriting in 2 cases. Notes from meetings, instructions." He looked at Clara steadily. "Your mother's case is explicitly documented. The date of the alteration. The reason given, I'll spare you the exact language, but the substance was that Blackwood believed she was unlikely to seek legal remedy given her age and circumstances. He believed she was unlikely to seek legal remedy." Clara sat with that sentence for a long moment. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. "He didn't count on the chest," Margaret said quietly. "No," Clara said. "He didn't." Ruth Haney uncrossed her arms and crossed them again and said, "What happens now, Ed?" With Vance's testimony and his documentation, Kemp said, "This moves from inquiry to prosecution. The federal district attorney in Helena has been briefed. Formal charges are expected within the week." He looked at the room. "Blackwood Savings and Loan will be placed in federal receivership pending full audit. All affected parties will be notified. Restitution proceedings will begin as part of the criminal case." Restitution. Clara's mind went to the house on Birch Lane. Her mother's house. Ethan had bought it at auction and had not touched a thing inside it. The cedar chest was at the ranch now. But the house itself, the walls her mother had lived between for 30 years, sat empty on Birch Lane waiting. She looked at Ethan. He was already looking at her. "The house," she said. "The auction proceeds will be returned as part of restitution," Price said. "The title, once the fraud is established, can be transferred to you as Eleanor Whitfield's heir." "Ethan purchased it at auction in good faith," Clara said. "He paid for it." "He'll be compensated from the restitution fund," Price said. "As will all parties." She kept looking at Ethan. He shook his head slightly. A small movement, just for her meaning. "Don't worry about that right now." She looked back at Kemp. "When will it be over?" "The criminal case will take months," Kemp said. "Possibly longer. But the receivership starts now. The asset hold becomes permanent as of today. Blackwood is not going to be able to move, sell, or transfer anything. He is not going to be able to reach any of the parties in this room or interfere with this process." He paused. "For practical purposes, it's over." The room absorbed that. Then Ruth Haney said in a voice that was steady, but not quite even, "Eleanor Whitfield never knew her daughter was going to do this." "No," Clara said. "She kept those records for 30 years, every payment, every letter." Ruth paused. "She must have been one hell of a woman." Clara's throat closed briefly. She opened it back up by sheer determination. "She was," she said. "She really was." The news moved through Red Hollow the way all news moved through Red Hollow, fast and with commentary. By the following morning, people knew. By Thursday, the federal receivership notice was posted on the door of Blackwood Savings and Loan, and a man from Helena was sitting behind the glass partition where Silas Vance used to stand, and the tellers were still at their windows because the bank didn't stop functioning. But the man running it was someone answerable to the federal government, rather than to Thomas Blackwood. Blackwood himself had been at the bank the morning the notice was posted. He had read it standing very straight in his good suit with his gold watch chain, and then he had walked out and gotten into his carriage and driven away. No one who was there reported that he said anything. He just left. Clara heard it from Margaret, who had heard it from the woman who swept the bank steps every morning. She was at the kitchen table when she heard it going over the ranch's fall supply estimates. She sat for a moment when Margaret finished telling her, and then she nodded once and looked back at her papers. Margaret watched her. "That's all," she said. "That's your reaction. What reaction did you expect?" "I don't know. Something." Clara looked up. "What I feel," she said, "is tired and grateful. And," she stopped. "And I wish my mother could have seen it. That's what I feel." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her hand and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. The days that followed had a different quality, lighter the way air feels after a long heat breaks. The ranch felt it too. Holt hummed sometimes in the mornings, which Clara had never heard him do before. Will's questions got more ambitious. Garrett made pie on a Thursday for no particular reason and left a piece on the kitchen table with her name on a scrap of paper beside it. And Ethan was different in a way that was hard to describe precisely, but impossible to miss. The guardedness hadn't disappeared. She didn't think it ever would entirely, because it was structural part of how he was built, and she'd stopped thinking of it as a wall and started thinking of it as just the shape of him. But within it, something had loosened. He talked more at meals. He came to find her in the evenings without manufacturing a reason. He had a habit, she'd noticed, of standing near where she was working, not intrusively, just near the way a person stands near a fire on a cold night, because the warmth is good. On the second Sunday after the receivership posting, he asked her if she wanted to ride. She'd never been on a horse at the Callahan ranch. She could ride, her father had taught her, but she hadn't asked because there were only so many things she wanted to ask for at once. He saddled a mare for her, a patient bay with a kind eye, and they rode out together into the high country where the summer was starting to show its edges. The mornings cooler, now the light at a different angle. They rode for an hour without talking, which was the best kind of riding, and when they stopped at the crest of a ridge and looked out at the mountains and the valley below, she understood why he lived up here. Why he'd stayed after everything that had happened. Why the northern quarter section was worth fighting for. "Your father chose well," she said. "He did," Ethan said. He was looking at the range, and something in his face was open the way it got sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. He used to say that you can measure a man by what he builds and what he keeps, that the building is easy compared to the keeping. Your father was right, she said. He looked at her. About a lot of things. They rode back slowly in the late morning, and when they came into the yard, Holt was at the corral with a look on his face that said something had happened. Letter came, Holt said. Rider from Helena. Clara took it. She opened it, standing in the yard. It was from the Federal District Attorney's Office. Formal charges had been filed against Thomas Blackwood on 14 counts of wire fraud, 4 counts of document forgery, and 2 counts of perjury. Arraignment was scheduled for the 3rd week of October. Restitution proceedings were formally opened. Affected parties would be contacted individually regarding their claims. 14 counts. She had known about 5 families. There were 14 counts. She read the letter a second time. Clara, Ethan said. She looked up. Both he and Holt were watching her. 14 counts, she said. There were 14 families. Holt made a sound in his throat that she'd learned meant something had hit him hard, and he wasn't going to say more than that. Ethan put his hand out, and she gave him the letter, and he read it, and she watched his face as he did, and when he finished, he folded it carefully, and held it out for her to take back, and said, Your mother's in there. She is, Clara said. And 13 other people's mothers, he said, and fathers, and families. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, You gave them that. Price gave them that. Kemp gave them that. Price and Kemp had the law, he said. You gave them the proof. He held her gaze. Don't minimize what you did. It matters. She looked at the letter in her hand and at the familiar handwriting of a federal attorney she'd never met, and she thought about 14 families sitting in their houses right now, maybe reading their own letters, maybe not yet knowing, but about to find out that someone had found what they'd lost and hadn't let go of it. Her eyes went bright. She let them. Holt cleared his throat and found somewhere else to be. Ethan stayed where he was. When she had herself back, she said, October 15th. He blinked. What? The land clause. Your birthday. October 15th. She looked at him. That's in 3 weeks. I know when my birthday is, he said. The county record shows us married, she said carefully. The clause is satisfied. In 3 weeks you'll be 40, and the northern section will be secure, and you won't need the arrangement anymore. The word arrangement sat in the air between them like a stone dropped in still water. Ethan looked at her. He was very still. Is that what you think this is still about? I'm telling you that you'll be free of the obligation, she said, and her voice was exactly level, which cost her more than she was going to admit. Whatever you want to happen after that, whatever makes sense for you, I'll understand. He took a step toward her. Clara, he said. I'm not fishing, she said quickly. I'm being practical. That's what I do. You're being afraid, he said, not unkind, just true. She stopped talking. You've been brave about everything else, he said. Since the day I met you. You stood in that street and you faced Blackwood and you faced the bank and you faced the inquiry and you stood up in a room full of people and said what was true. He was close enough now that she could see the exact quality of his expression, none of the guardedness, none of the careful flatness, just him. Are you really going to be afraid of this? This is different, she said very quietly. I know, he said. That's why it matters more. She looked at him. The yard was warm and still, and the horses were moving in the corral, and somewhere behind her, Holt was pointedly making noise at the far end of the barn. I came here as an arrangement, she said. You did, he agreed. I told myself it was practical. I know. And now, she stopped. Ethan, I don't want to mistake convenience for something else. I don't want either of us to confuse what this started as with what it is. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it the way you take something you've decided belongs with you. What it started as, he said, was 2 people who needed something. What it is. He paused, and she understood that he was choosing words with the same care he brought to everything, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to get it right. "Is the first time in 14 years I've had a reason to come inside before dark." She looked at him. "The first time I've sat at my own kitchen table and wanted to stay there," he said. "The first time I've—" He stopped. The line of his jaw moved. "Clara, I don't know how to say it the way a better man might say it, but I know what this is, and I know what I want, and October 15th has nothing to do with it." She looked at their hands. His were rough and certain. Hers were shaking very slightly, which she noted with some irritation. "I want to stay," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking you to. I want to fix the north pasture fence, which has been a problem since August." Something shifted in his face. "It has," he said, "and I want Will to learn double-entry bookkeeping by spring. I think that's achievable. And I want—" She looked up at him. "I want my mother's house. Not to live in, but to keep. To put something there that means something." "It's yours," he said. "Whatever you want it to be." She squeezed his hand once tight, and he squeezed back. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. Holt chose that moment to come around the corner of the barn, see them stop entirely, turn around, and go back the way he'd come. Clara laughed. It came out full and real, and surprised her with how good it felt. Ethan looked at her, and the thing she'd been watching move across his face for weeks, that guarded warmth. That careful something finally came all the way to the surface, and he smiled. A real one. The kind you don't perform, just have. She had not seen him smile like that before. She thought she'd like to see it again. The October hearing came on a clear, cold morning, and Clara sat in the federal courthouse in Helena beside Ethan and Franklin Price. And across the room, Thomas Blackwood sat with his defense attorneys and his silver hair and his gold watch chain. And she looked at him and felt not triumph, not satisfaction. Something quieter. A kind of completion. He looked older than he had in his bank in July. The certainty had gone out of him. He still held himself well. A man who had spent 60 years believing he was the most important person in any room he walked into. Doesn't simply stop, but the room didn't respond to him the way rooms had responded to him before. People looked at him differently. Some didn't look at him at all. Ruth Haney was 2 rows behind Clara, with the Connollys beside her. James Connolly's wife had her hands folded in her lap, and her chin level, and her eyes clear. The arraignment was formal and procedural, and not dramatic in the way of stories. The judge read the charges. The defense entered a plea. A trial date was set for the following spring. The restitution proceedings were confirmed as active. Clara listened to every word. When it was over, Price shook her hand on the courthouse steps and said, "I'll be in touch about the next steps for the restitution claim. I believe your case is among the strongest, given the documentation." "Thank you, Mr. Price," she said, "for everything." "Thank your mother," he said. "She's the one who kept the records." She walked down the courthouse steps with Ethan beside her, and the cold October air came off the mountains, and she breathed it in. "Spring," she said. "That's when the trial starts," he said. "It could run longer." "I know." She looked at the mountains. "That's all right. We have time." He glanced at her. "We." "Unless you'd like to file some kind of objection." "No objection," he said. They drove home. The land clause was satisfied on October 15th, which was Ethan's 40th birthday. He mentioned it at breakfast quietly, matter-of-factly, the way a man mentions something he's been carrying for years and can now set down. Clara made him a cake because Garrett had the day off and she wanted to, and she didn't manufacture a more complicated reason than that. He looked at the cake on the kitchen table when he came in for supper, and then at her and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. "Eat your cake." He ate his cake. Holt appeared in the kitchen at the precise moment dessert was produced and looked unsurprised by it, which meant Garrett had told him, which meant nothing at this ranch was ever as private as it seemed. Will appeared directly behind Holt. Clara cut cake for all of them. Holt raised his coffee cup and said without ceremony, "Happy birthday, boss." And Will said the same, and Garrett, appearing suddenly from the back door, said it third. Ethan looked around his kitchen at the people in it. "Thank you," he said in the voice he used when he meant something exactly and precisely. Clara caught his eye across the table. He held her gaze. The winter came down hard and clean, and the ranch went into its cold weather rhythm, the particular industry of a working place, preparing to sustain itself through months of wait and difficulty. Clara learned the winter work alongside the summer work she already knew. She learned the pace of it, the patience it required, the particular satisfaction of a system that works because everyone in it knows what they're doing and does it without drama. She wrote to Jacob Trent and thanked him for his testimony and told him what it had contributed. She received a letter back 3 pages from a man who seemed genuinely relieved to have done it, who had spent 2 years knowing something was wrong and not having a place to put that knowledge. She wrote to Rachel Marsh every few weeks. Rachel wrote back, and her letters were the letters of a woman who was finding her way through grief and finding on the other side of it that she still had things to say and people to say them to. The house on Birch Lane was returned to Eleanor Whitfield's estate by court order in December, which meant it was returned to Clara. She went to town twice to look at it, walking through the rooms, slowly touching the walls, standing in the kitchen, where her mother had made biscuits every Sunday morning for 30 years. She knew what she wanted to do with it. She told Ethan on a Sunday evening. She'd been thinking about the Connolly wife's words for months. He always waits. Until you're already on your knees, and she'd been thinking about all the people in this county who found themselves on their knees, who had no Cedar Chest, and no Franklin Price, and no one to stand beside them. "I want to use the house," she said, "as a resource, a place where people can come if they have questions about contracts or loans or legal documents. Not a lawyer's office, just a place, with someone in it who knows how to read a document and ask the right questions." Ethan looked at her across the kitchen table. "Someone like you," he said. "Possibly me," she said, "and possibly others. Margaret has said she'd be involved. Ruth Haney has said she'd come back from Billings to help set it up." "You've already talked to Margaret and Ruth about this," he said. "I've been thinking about it for a while," she said. "I wanted to know if it was viable before I mentioned it." He was quiet for a moment. "And is it?" "I think so." She looked at him. "Do you have an objection?" "No objection?" he said, which had become the standing answer between them, a kind of shorthand that meant, "I trust you. I'm with you. Do what needs doing." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Ethan." "Yeah. I love you." It came out simpler than she expected. Just those 4 words, plainly the way she said true things. He went very still. Not surprised she didn't think she had surprised him. More like a man who has been waiting for something and when it arrives, stands motionless for a moment to make sure it's real. Then he said, "I know." She raised an eyebrow. "I've known for a while," he said. "I just didn't want to rush you." "You were waiting," she said. "I had practice," he said. "The horses." She looked at him. He was absolutely serious. She felt the laugh coming and let it go. He stood up and came around the table to her and took her face in both his hands, the same hands that managed horses with exactly the right amount of tension, not too tight and not too loose, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for weeks all the way through, with nothing held back. "I love you," he said. "I've been working up to saying it for a while." "How long?" she said. "Since you looked at my salt receipts and told me I was overpaying," he said. She laughed again, and he kissed her, and outside the winter pressed against the windows, and inside the kitchen was warm, and somewhere in the house Holt was pointedly making himself scarce. The spring trial was long and technical, and Clara sat through most of it watching 12 jurors absorb the documentation her mother had kept so carefully for 30 years. Price presented it methodically, one piece at a time, building the structure brick by brick, and Vance testified for 3 days in a row, and answered every question without flinching. And Rachel Marsh took the stand on a Thursday afternoon in April, and told the jury, in a clear, steady voice, exactly what she had witnessed at that signing table in March of 1875. The jury took 2 days to deliberate. Thomas Blackwood was convicted on 11 of 14 counts. Clara was standing outside the courthouse with Ethan when the verdict was read and Price came out and told them, and she nodded and thanked him and shook his hand and turned away and looked at the mountains. Ethan stood beside her. 11 counts, she said. 11 counts, he confirmed. My mother's case was one of them. Yes. She breathed in the spring air, cool still, the mountains still carrying snow at their peaks, the valley below coming green. She thought about a woman who had paid $14 every month for 3 years and written "Do not lose" and underlined it twice, and given her daughter enough ammunition to undo a powerful man's very careful scheme. She won, Clara said. You both won, Ethan said. She turned to look at him. His face was open and warm in the spring light. The man she'd found inside the flat, careful exterior, the one that had been there all along, waiting the way the mountains were there behind clouds. Take me home, she said. He took her hand. Yeah, he said. All right. Years later, people in Red Hollow would remember Clara Callahan the way they remembered things that changed the shape of a place, not a dramatic monument, just a permanent alteration, the kind where you couldn't quite picture what the town had looked like before her. The house on Birch Lane became what she'd said it would become. Margaret ran it on weekdays. Ruth Haney came up from Billings 4 times a year to help with the more complicated cases. Clara went when she was needed and trained others to go when she wasn't. Ethan built a bookshelf for it one November, installed it himself, drove all the way to town and back in a single day, and didn't mention it afterward. Holt, who witnessed him loading the wagon with lumber at 5 in the morning, told Will, who told Garrett, who told Margaret, who told Clara. She didn't mention it to Ethan for 3 days. On the 4th day, she said, Holt tells me you built the bookshelf. Holt should mind his own business, Ethan said. It's a good shelf, she said. Level, strong. He looked at her. I had a good reason to build it right. She put her hand on his arm briefly. He covered her hand with his and didn't let go. The Callahan ranch prospered. It prospered because Ethan knew cattle and horses and the high country the way he'd always known them, and because Clara knew numbers and people and what it took to keep a complex thing from quietly falling apart. And because Holt was Holt, and Will turned out to be better with accounts than he'd thought, and Garrett kept making pie on Thursdays. The northern quarter section stayed in the family. The land Thomas Blackwood had coveted, that 40 yards of mountain meadow that Ethan's father had built his claws around, that piece of high country so full of grass and clean water that powerful men spent years wanting it stayed exactly where it was, because a man and a woman and a cedar chest full of 30 years of careful records had stood together and refused to let it go. They had a son the following spring. They named him Daniel for Ethan's father, and Eleanor for Clara's mother Eleanor as a middle name, which was unusual, but the judge who recorded the birth in Red Hollow was Franklin Price's former client and didn't raise an eyebrow. Daniel. Ethan. Eleanor Callahan grew up knowing the mountains and the horses and the high country, and he knew the story of his grandmother's cedar chest, because Clara told it to him every year on Eleanor Whitfield's birthday, the whole thing start to finish. The cedar chest sat in the front room of the Callahan ranch on a low shelf, and Daniel used it as a step stool when he was small, and learned what it meant when he was old enough to understand. Clara would say, finishing the story, your grandmother kept every record, every payment, every letter. She kept them because she knew the truth mattered even when no one was listening yet. And she would say, someone is always going to come along eventually who knows how to use the truth. Your job is to make sure the truth is kept somewhere they can find it. And Daniel, who had his mother's eyes and his father's particular kind of stillness, would nod the way his father nodded, once deliberate meaning understood, and then he'd go back outside because the horses didn't tend themselves. Ethan watched this every year. Watched Clara tell the story and watched his son receive it. He never interrupted. He just sat nearby the way he sat near things that mattered to him steadily, the way a mountain sits near a valley, permanent and present and not going anywhere. Clara caught him watching one evening after Daniel had gone out, and she raised an eyebrow. What? she said. "Nothing," he said. Then, "You told it differently this year." "Did I?" "You added something at the end, about keeping the truth somewhere it can be found." She looked at the cedar chest on the shelf. "Is that not how it ends?" He looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his face was the same thing that had been there since the beginning. Behind the flat exterior, the careful reserve. The man who had spent 14 years learning not to hold on to things. The warmth he'd stopped hiding, and the steadiness he'd always had. And something underneath both of those that didn't have a word in any language she knew, except this chosen. He had chosen her that day in the street, when he hadn't known her, and didn't know why. And she had chosen to stay. And they had built this thing together piece by piece, the way his father had built the ranch, with their hands and their stubbornness, and the conviction that what you love is worth the work of keeping. "That's exactly how it ends," he said. She sat beside him, and his hand found hers, and outside the mountains stood in the late evening, and the high country held the last of the light. And inside the ranch house that Daniel Callahan's grandfather had built with his hands, a fire burned clean and certain. This was the life they had made. It was not a perfect life. It was better than that. It was real.